Hi, how is everybody? We have finally made it. I've had a few technical glitches today, so it's been a bit of a nightmare getting this up and running, but I am very excited to see that the video is working, the chat is working, and hopefully we're going to have a really lovely evening together. For those of you that don't know me, I'm sure a lot of you do, because I'm pretty sure some of my friends are tuning in this evening. I'm Suzanne Moore, and my debut novel, The Place Between, hi Jess, was released on the 15th of March. So it's a very, very new little baby in the world. And so I'm unbelievably excited to be in a position to share that with you this evening and to have a bit of a chat while we all spend a Thursday night at home. I'll just have a little bit of a talk with you before I get too into it, in case other people are joining. I have a little secret to confess. I realised when I was getting ready tonight, and I did my hair and I put on some makeup, which I haven't done for actually since my book launch. And then I sprayed myself with perfume, and so I smell absolutely delightful. Even though there's not a soul in my house, I have abandoned my family for the evening, and none of you can actually experience all this effort that I have put in. But it makes me feel a little bit more professional, so it makes me hide from the fact that I'm also wearing woolly socks underneath the desk to get through the chilly night. I don't know what you've all been doing in isolation. I felt a little overwhelmed, to be honest. I sort of had these heady hopes that I would power through a second novel, and that by now I'd have 50,000 words under my belt. But if I'm really honest, I've probably only written maybe 4,000 words in the last month, which is going to take me a very long time to write a new book if I'm going to work that slowly. But I think we all have to be realistic about what we're capable of doing while we're at home in an environment that we're not used to, spending time very intensely with our families, which we weren't planning, and for me at least, having to supervise education for my children, which makes doing my own kind of work and having that creative headspace really difficult. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is just to share with you a little bit of how my journey to writing happened, because I am a mature age writer. I went back to university late, so my career path for writing hasn't been a particularly straight trajectory. So I'd like to kind of go through how things evolved for me up to the publication of this book, and talk to you about some of the ideas and events that led to the writing of the book. And then I'd like to read a little bit of it for you, just so you can get a feel for it. And then after that, just before I answer some questions, I would like to add a little bit, which I haven't actually made notes on, but I did a post for Louise Allen's Writers in the Attic this week, and it was such a useful experience because it made me think very long and hard about what I got out of writing this book. And it was something very, very different from what I thought I was going to get when I went into the process of writing the book. So I would like to split this evening's talk into, I wasn't a child that was a prolific producer of fictional works. As you hear about some writers, were always churning out things. But I was very consistent. It was something that was always in the back of my mind. From that moment in year 2, when I got a merit certificate for my short story, The Land of Zero, I had convinced myself that I could be a writer, or that I was a writer. Getting an honour certificate in year 2 didn't mean that you were some kind of uber talent. It just meant it was your turn to get an honour certificate. But the wonderful thing about those little kind of affirmations set those wheels in motion, that in my mind I could be a writer, that I was good at writing stories. So throughout my school career, I constantly wrote, not a lot, but I was always had a little story on the go. If I went away on holiday, I always wrote a little story about it. I always had a notebook with me. I used to bore my friends with overblown anecdotes, and I kind of had this idea that what's the point of telling your friends that you've gone to the shops to get a milk? That's very boring. Create some kind of exciting adventure about how you went to get the milk. And it didn't necessarily need to be true. So this was something that kind of became a bit of a theme through primary school and high school, and I would write letters to my friends, and I would write stories for them for their birthdays and illustrate them terribly. And I'm pretty sure I have friends who have some horrible, in retrospect, not very funny and poorly drawn pictures, books that I have written for them over the years as souvenirs, and maybe they can blackmail me with them in the future. So I loved reading, obviously. I mean, I don't think there's a writer in the world who doesn't, thank you, Bernadette, who doesn't read, and I think it's impossible to produce any form of creative work in a vacuum if you're not with a torch or flicking the light on and off when my mum and dad went past, just devouring books, particularly as a teenager, and particularly fantasy books, which I guess is no surprise then that time travel, that fantasy and science fiction, that time travel has become a feature in my first novel. In high school, I got the top prize for literature in a hard-fought battle with my best friend. And my father wanted me to do journalism. My principal had said I should be a newsreader. And so I took the very, very obvious next step in what had been a long-term history of connection to writing and literature, and enrolled the night before my form was due into veterinary medicine. But I also was a science lover, so I guess it's not that big a leap. And quite honestly, my 5 years in university as a veterinarian were some of the most amazing years of my life. Vet school is a little bit like high school all over again. You have 60 people, 50 hours a week for 5 years, very competitive, very intense. It's quite gratifying. You get to pretend you're very clever and that you're doing something really important, and the work is interesting and fun, and the people are funny. And so for those kind of years of my life, writing very much took a back seat as the intenseness of doing a kind of hard science degree took over. And in fact, reading took a very big backseat in my life at that point. I realised I had a couple of years after I had graduated from university, I was working in a very busy small animal veterinary practice, and I was doing a lot of after hours and a lot of surgery, and that side of life was very exciting and challenging, and I had great colleagues. But I felt for the first time in a long time a kind of lack from that creative side. I had been so science-driven for so long that I really felt the need to get back into it. So I re-enrolled at university 2 years after I graduated and did an undergraduate degree in creative writing back at Murdoch University. And it was a completely different landscape. I was an old student at 24, I think, and I really did feel old compared to the 18-year-olds. And I wasn't the smartest in the room anymore, or not that I was with my vet friends, but these people had spent years immersed in creativity and immersed in literary theory, and I was absolutely swamped with just how inspiring and interesting and amazing this world was that I had pushed aside while I studied my science degree. And I became absolutely obsessed with it. And I'm not sure when I knew, but at some point I made the realization that that was actually the path that I wanted to follow. As much as being a veterinarian is a very glamorous degree, and people love it, they love talking about their pets. And even to this day, I get this sort of look of horror from people when I tell them that I'm no longer a vet, as though I've kind of taken what was this amazing treasure and thrown it away. But for me, it was a really necessary divergence in my life, and it made me the person that I was. And it made me ready for the creative side, because I really feel that if I had gone back to university, if I'd gone to university to study arts as an 18-year-old, I would have been a horrible failure. Like I would have dropped out. I didn't have the mindset or the ability to be introspective that you need to have to really get the best value out of an arts degree. So when I finished my undergrad in creative writing, I flipped straight into an honours in creative writing, and I was juggling running my own veterinary practice at the same time while I studied full-time. But that was, again, an amazing year for me. I got to spend an entire year supervised on a single project, and I ended up writing a novelette called The Station, which was about a young girl who lived in a train station where nobody knew the timetable, and people would wait for years and years and years on end for a train that would just rock up and take them to somewhere else that they didn't know. And that arrived from a very peculiar dream I had, and ended up being the basis of my honours thesis, and was published in 2013 in Tincture, an online literary journal, which unfortunately is no more. But if you are interested in reading that, you can still buy that from Amazon. And it's a story I keep thinking I may revisit. I've had a few people say that they want to know where my character goes to, and I think it would probably make a really good young adult novel if I ever get the energy to revamp it. So that kind of took me into my late 20s by the time I had done all that and pushed my career forward on the veterinary side of things. And I had decided to take a break from study because I'd been at university for 10 years continuous by this point. But my supervisor at the time sort of suggested that I would be a good candidate to do a PhD. And I don't know how well you know your veterinarians or whether you are a vet, but we have these really big egos and like a good challenge. And so if somebody says to me, I think you would be great at doing this incredibly difficult thing, it's almost impossible for me to refuse. And the kind of drive in me forces me to do it. And so the year I got married and the year I had my first daughter, I started a PhD in creative writing with a very vain, arrogant, egotistical notion that I was not only going to run a veterinary practice and look after a child full time, not put them in daycare. I was going to care for this child, and I was going to write a PhD thesis, and I was going to nail all of them at once. And so, like an idiot, I launched into this new life of mine. And it's very unsurprising, I think, that it failed miserably. I was terrible at all three because I just couldn't do three such strenuous things at the same time. So I knew where my heart lay, and it was no longer with vet science. So I stopped practicing and focused entirely on my family and my study. And I moved to the hills, or back to the hills, and committed myself completely to motherhood and PhD. I was still an idiot because, again, any of you with children will know that doing kind of productive, deep thinking work with a baby or a toddler in the house, and later on too, and dogs and cats, and chopping firewood and looking after a big property and building a house, they don't work together. And so I really struggled in the early years of my PhD study to get the work done and to do what I needed to do. And so in the end, my PhD actually took 10 years to do. And it got to the point where my very dear friends kind of would ask me, like, how's it going? are you okay? And a lot of people just stopped asking altogether. But I did finish it, and I did get a book out of it by a very wonderful series of happy circumstance and coincidence. Jen Hutchison from JTW Publishing happened to be my neighbour in Japan, and she happened to be looking for a new author when I happened to have a raw manuscript available. And so we kind of fell into each other in a really wonderful way and spent a year working together to bring my book from what was a PhD thesis up to publication level. So that's kind of how I got to get the book there. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about how the book itself came to be before I read you some. I'm just going to have a sip of tea. So obviously books have to come from somewhere, and my book at the time, or my story at the time, had to do a double job. It needed to be a story, and it needed to be standalone all by itself and read from beginning to end as though it was just written to be a story. But it also needed to answer the critical question of my PhD thesis. And at the time, I was really interested in motherhood, and I was really interested in time. Again, I've got a bit of a sciencey background. I love science fiction and science fantasy. And so the idea that time is a concept in our head that we create and that we allow to dictate the rules of our day really amazed me. And I wanted to investigate how various uses of time would influence how I could write my characters. And I won't go into, don't worry, I'm not going to go into the details of my PhD thesis for you, but essentially I wanted to look at how we imagine history versus how we imagine time within the home, so domestic time. And I think those of you who have stayed at home and been a carer in any capacity will understand that that kind of time frame runs very differently to the kind of very straight linear imagining of time we have when we think of past, present and future and the longevity of our society. And so I was very interested in how these two and then later three modes of time could play off each other to give us insights into how women and mothers in particular are written in fiction. So that, I guess, begs the question of where did my characters come from? And why this particular story, because they are actually quite different from me, these characters. My family are immigrants from Ireland, and so I'm not or wasn't an outback Australia kind of girl when I grew up. I grew up around clusters of Irish people singing and partying, and just very, very different to the sort of lifestyle that my characters have led. But it all started at Perth Airport when I was pregnant with my daughter, and I was going to Japan to meet my husband and my parents for a very quick, cheeky holiday before, the baby was born. And I'm sitting in the departure lounge, and there was a couple probably in their 60s having a heated discussion about how disappointed they were with their daughter because when they go to visit her, she never makes them pudding. So she'll cook dinner, she'll take care of them, she has them to stay with her, but she never makes dessert. And this couple were so incensed of the betrayal of hospitality that this daughter had committed in not producing dessert for them every day, that they couldn't get over it. And I was intrigued as to what kind of insight that gave me into their relationship. If that was such a sticking point for them, something so minor, what else was going on in their relationship? What other demands were they making of that woman? And how did they see her as a member of their society? And so that's where Beryl, and I'm pretty sure the couple that I was listening in on were called Bruce and Beryl. If they weren't actually called Bruce and Beryl, I had named them that by the time I boarded the plane, and Sarah came from. And so it got me thinking about how do we create the identity of the other people in our family so that we can be disappointed by them. My Beryl character clearly had an idea of what she thought Sarah should be, what she thought her daughter should be, and she wasn't living up to that. And I'm sure that the dessert was just the tip of the iceberg. And then on the flip side, I imagined a woman about my age, she aged 10 years over the writing of the book, feeling the same way about her mother, this idea of expectation and reality and who her mother thinks she is versus who she thinks she is. And I sort of suddenly felt this disparity between our identity in ourselves and our identity in the public sphere and our identity within our family. And I realised that we are all very fractured and we all present different faces depending on where we are. And that's where time became really useful for me, because I was able to kind of explore these versions of the truth or versions of identity via the time travel elements in the book. And it was a really exciting way of looking at what is normally considered quite a mundane topic, because I was very, very interested in writing women's daily lives rather than epic adventures, because the kind of the domestic and the daily elements of our lives are often overlooked when we as women are written into fiction. So that's kind of how my book came to be. I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if Sarah, the real Sarah, the one that Sarah's based on, had been a better daughter in her mother's eyes. What kind of book I would have written. Would I have written this book at all if I hadn't have had that kind of golden opportunity to overhear this conversation and this little snapshot of daily life just while I was sitting by myself? And how many other amazing little insights do we all miss when we're so absorbed in what we're doing rather than listening to what's going on around us? I'm going to take a sip of tea and then I'm going to read a little bit from my book and let you all have a rest with your ears for a second. Give you 2 seconds to top up your wine. So the excerpt that I am going to read for you is just a small section from chapter 2. I'll give you a little bit of a background into what's happening with my characters. So Beryl is still in Perth. She hasn't come to see her daughter in Sydney yet. Sarah is pregnant and she's just completed her last day of work at the hospital where she is a doctor. And this is her first day at home with her 5-year-old son, David, and pregnant with her second child, who's going to be is a girl. Okay. Day 1. Sarah looked at her watch. 10 a.m. Perhaps she should scratch marks into the wall. She should ring her mother, but it was 7 a.m. in Perth. She dared not ring Beryl so early. Waking Beryl was never a good idea. Sarah and her brother Andrew had learned to revere Beryl's sleep for the precious hours of unobserved solitude it provided on Saturday mornings. They'd watched television with the sound low or lazed on the couch reading a book in their pyjamas before the bustle of weekend chores descended. Sarah unlocked her phone. She scrolled through the morning's newsfeed, the usual jumble of gossip and fear-mongering. The Greens wanted an inquiry into renewables. The government didn't. Beyonce had a health scare. Anti-vaxxers were staging a protest at Parliament House. A video of a hamster eating a tiny burrito had gone viral. Sarah smiled at its chubby cheeks and tiny humanoid hands. A car bomb outside a mosque. Sarah flung the phone onto the table, took a mouthful of tea and spat it back into the cup. It was freezing. She'd started the day with optimism. She woke early to see Luke off to work, enjoying the luxury of a conversation beyond the usual morning ritual of grunts and hurried kisses before they went their separate ways. The kitchen sparkled. The washing machine was on its third load. She'd cooked scrambled eggs for David. He'd turned his nose up at them, and informing her they weren't his favourite anymore. In the interests of a good start to her new life, she indulged him and made pancakes, eating the eggs herself. David disappeared to his room after breakfast, leaving Sarah alone with nothing to do for the first time in years. She tapped the table. After a few seconds, she lifted her phone again. There were no new notifications. She checked the time. Still too soon to ring Beryl. What was David doing up there? She stood, putting her phone into her back pocket as she moved to the bottom of the stairs. "David!" she called. No response. Thumping drew her up the stairs. It grew louder as she approached David's closed door, the sound heavy and dull, like a rubber mallet striking wood. She paused outside, listening. The sound stopped, but she heard him talking to himself. Should she leave him? How did the saying go? Don't poke the bear. Only a fool disrupted a contented child playing on their own. On the other hand, she'd stopped work a few weeks early to spend time with him before the baby was born and chaos reigned again. She needed to embrace being a stay-at-home mum. The STAIM, the acronym made her shudder, unlocking a foreign lexicon that left her feeling inadequate. Were the meals she cooked healthy enough? Was David engaged? Was he meeting his cognitive milestones? Was he developing socially? Beryl hadn't worried about those things. Beryl had been a boredom-is-good-for-you kind of mother, full of tough love. She demanded, rather than fostered, independence in her children. Sarah's hand hovered over the door handle. She couldn't pinpoint the source of her reluctance to open it. Was she frightened of what she'd find? Nests? Broken things strewn across the carpet? Or did she fear her reaction to it? David? She peered around the door. What met her was not the carnage of emptied toy boxes she'd expected. Nothing broken. Instead, David had transformed the floor space into an enormous train track, clipping together multiple sets. He made train noises as he pushed the colourful wagons forward. 2 oversized tin-press robots perched on the top of the lead carriage. He scooted around the track, one knee on the ground, hands splayed on the carpet for balance, the other foot inching forward to keep pace with the train's progress. "Hi, Mummy," he said, glancing up, his curls obscuring his face. "What's up?" "What's up? Is he a teenager now?" "Nothing, sweetheart, just making sure you're okay." "I'm okay," he said. "What was that noise?" she asked. "What noise?" "I heard banging." David sat back on his heels, frowning. "You did?" Sarah widened her eyes. He jumped up, lifting a plastic figurine that lay among the crumpled sheets on his bed. "I tried to fix Max, but I couldn't get his leg back in. I banged it really hard, but it didn't work." "Ah, I see. I could look at it for you." "Nah, Dad can fix it." He tossed the broken action figure onto the bed and went back to his train set. Sarah leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching. The scene was too perfect, as if someone had made it up to prove her fears were unfounded. A wave of guilt swept through her. What had she expected? That he'd taken to his room with a hammer? He was boisterous, yes, but not out of control. She tapped into a vein of paranoia. What if she wasn't a good enough mother after all? The daily routines of childcare were foreign to her. She'd let them fall to Lisa, their nanny, while she'd worked to push her career forward. The early years were a blur of overtime and study, driven by a laser focus on achievement. Her time with David tended to consist of hectic cramming of errands, going to special kindergarten events, or burning energy at the playground on her days off. There hadn't been time for anything else. Beryl's voice whispered to her, "Do you even know him?" Sarah refused to let the thought take hold. "I'm his mother." She closed her eyes, replaying the last time she saw Beryl. They'd fought, among many things, about David, about his upbringing, about Sarah's work, about the nanny. Beryl hadn't liked her. She even tried to fire her one afternoon, as though Sarah was a child who needed her mother to organise her life. "He doesn't need a smart mother," Beryl had said. "Your career doesn't love him or make him feel safe. David needs you, not some teenager you imported from Sweden." Had Beryl been right? Sarah had never admitted, could never admit, she was frightened of being responsible for David. Now there was going to be a new little person in their lives. She was supposed to be the competent one. She cared for people for a living. Motherhood? It terrified her in a way nothing else did. Sarah forced the thought away, opening her eyes to concentrate on watching David build his imaginary world. "Why are you standing there?" David asked. "No reason. I like your train set. Haven't seen you play with it much." He shrugged. "Yeah, it's a bit boring. Henry has one that runs by itself. It goes so fast and has lights and makes lots of different noises. It's way better than this one." "Lucky Henry." "Yeah." David went back to pushing the train set around in an awkward one-knee shuffle. Okay, so I'm sure you're getting a vibe that Sarah isn't really sure what she's doing being a mum at home with kids. That's not who she has seen herself to be, and it's not how the world has validated her. And so I really wanted to explore in this book that notion that it's okay that we are frightened of being mums, and that we're frightened of caring for little kids, and that it's okay that as people at home with children, we want also to be recognised as something other than the mother of that child. And I didn't realise until I wrote that post for Louise Allen this week just how big a journey I had gone on in this book, dealing with that very issue myself. Like I said, people love that you're a vet, and they do get terribly disappointed when you tell them that you're no longer a vet, as though it's some kind of betrayal to a dream of their childhood. And to give up what is a very respected career to spend time at home with your family is psychologically very difficult and emotionally very difficult. And I found this book, I didn't realise it at the time, I thought I was answering a theoretical question about women's lives and time, really helped me deal with some of those issues I was going through when I was at home alone with my kids. Time for a cup of tea. So nobody's written any questions yet. Some people have sent some through beforehand. So I will start answering some of those, but please do, if you have anything you would like to ask, please do pop them up on the chat, and I will hopefully be able to answer them in a coherent way and not get too croaky. So the first question is from Joanna, and she has written here, "In the place between, spiders are the harbingers of Sarah's recurring time trips. I like that. Can you tell us more about that decision?" So the spiders came in very, very late in the drafting process. We were trying to work out ways to signal the time travel for the reader, that they knew as soon as they saw whatever it was they saw, a feeling, a look, a sound, that the next section would drive them into the past or into a new experience for Sarah. And I've always been a bit of a fan, it's the kind of lit dork in me, of looking for a bit of a symbol or a totem to guide the readers through a book. And spiders were a wonderful analogy for time, I felt. Partially because spiders themselves are a symbol of grandmothers, which I thought was really neat, given that this is an intergenerational narrative. But also I love that idea of their beautiful webs, that everything is so intricately connected, and if you tweak a string on this side, something happens over this side, but not necessarily in a straight line. And so obviously the past acting or being present in the daily lives of my characters, whether they know it's there or not, is a really important feature of the book. And so that's why I felt spiders were really useful, and also they're kind of cool and do lots of different things, so you can have them in lots of different settings, so hopefully it doesn't become too repetitive. Karen has written in and she has asked, were the storyline and characters' perspectives well developed in your mind prior to writing the story, or did you find them evolving as you wrote the book? That's a really good question. Sarah and Beryl as characters were very fixed in my mind from the beginning. Like, they didn't change in the 12 years from when I first started writing them to today. I knew exactly who those two characters were, and their relationship was very clear for me. And how I delved into that changed many times. And in fact, up until about 6 months before my thesis was submitted, Beryl had a whole third of the book to herself from her perspective. And so, no, certainly the way the story unravelled and the trajectory the story took, and as well what happened with Lillian, that evolved over the years, that evolved over time. I didn't know where that was going. I'm a bit of a what's called a pantser. I tend not to sit down and plot my stories. I really like my characters to tell me where to go rather than me telling them. And I often do find that I wake up in the night with the two of them jabbering in my head, and I have to kind of get up and write a couple of pages of dialogue because I can hear them talking much, much more clearly than I know what their story is going to be. And they sort of tend to talk themselves, like talking therapy, into the book. Okay, so Paul has sent in a question. What is your writing warm-up routine to get you ready to have a good session? That's also a really good question, and it varies from day to day and how motivated I am, which is a terrible answer because you are supposed to develop, like everything else, a ritual that you partake in to trick your mind into saying, yep, it's time to work. I always have a cup of tea, always. And when I'm really serious, when I'm getting down to kind of really hard work, I actually meditate for just about 5 or 6 minutes beforehand. Smiling Mind does this incredible study meditation that just, you don't think it's going to work the first couple of minutes, you're all over the place, but miraculously by the end of it, you open your eyes and bang, you're ready to go. So I do find that very helpful if I'm feeling very distracted and unable to focus on getting my work done. Adeline has sent a question, it's a bit cheeky. Can we have a sneak peek at what the book you are currently writing is about? So it's about women, and I don't really want to tell you any more than that. About 3 women again. The problem with sharing too much very early on is it always sounds incredibly stupid. It always sounds like a terrible idea. And it's never a good idea until it's finished and polished and great. And then people go, oh, wow, that's a really good idea. But if you try and explain it too early, you get that kind of blank look from people, and it kills the creativity a little bit. So I'm going to be a bit reticent about sharing with you much more than that. But it is multi-generational, not relatives, 3 women, 3 interwoven stories. Adeline sent another question. She's very prolific. I know you recently attended Margaret Atwood and Neil Gaiman live. Can you tell me if their inspirational words have sparked some new ideas for you? I did go see Neil Gaiman and Margaret Atwood at the Perth Writers Festival. I was a complete fangirl and I went entirely on my own and just, I didn't care. It was amazing. And yes, it certainly did. The night I saw Neil Gaiman, he was so good. he read so much of his work out and just shared so much that I went home and had an incredibly vivid dream, very Neil Gaiman weird, and got up the next morning and wrote a short story straight away, like just. So if I could just have him piped into my ear every night, maybe I could just smash out a whole heap of work. It would be amazing. Margaret Atwood was more intimidating. She was incredible again, but she's so smart and she's so worldly and eloquent and politically informed, and I just sat in awe and envy of her career and her talent and her intelligence, and I wish more of the world was like her, and I wish I was more like her. Okay, so Adeline sent another question. Can we have a sneak peek? Oh no, what is your inspiration for your children's books, and when will you start releasing children's books? Well, I think everybody with kids wants to write a children's book, right? Because you know their quirky little sense of humour better than anybody else. So you have this magic way of getting your own children just to lose it and fall off the floor laughing. But I do have a couple of kids' books ideas in mind, and I am happy to share those ones because they're a bit more settled in my mind. I really want to write a kind of middle school, upper middle school adventure story for girls. A bit kind of inspired by Stand By Me and the Goonies, that sort of style of camaraderie books where girls get to explore their friendships outside of the kind of imposed rivalries we see normally in girls' narratives. I'm not interested in popularity or boyfriends or clothes or makeup for young girls. I really want to know what is inside them. And so I'm kind of quite keen to get onto a book where 4 girls or a group of girls get to explore female friendship outside of rivalry, because we all know how important that is in our lives. Okay, so Shelley has just asked a really good question. So the editing process from a PhD thesis to published books, did much of the manuscript change? Yeah, that's a really good question. It was hard because, of course, by the time you get to the end of a PhD thesis, you're shattered. You're absolutely exhausted and you wish never to set eyes on any of it again. My thesis is bound and on my shelf and I have never opened it, and I'm not sure I ever will, and I think that's pretty normal. I took a full year off from when I submitted my PhD, in fact a little bit more, from when I submitted my PhD to when I felt ready to take the manuscript out of the cupboard and start working on it again. I had a manuscript assessment done with Writers Victoria, and they were able to, Kate Ryan at Writers Victoria was able to give me some really good insight into what was working, why it worked for a PhD novel and why it didn't work for a commercial novel. So essentially, I had to cut down a 120,000 word draft to 45,000 words to make it complete and whole as a story and half of a PhD thesis. And that meant I had to be really brutal, which is why Beryl got cut. My third of the novel got completely just cut out. And so what ended up happening for me was that the bones of the story stayed the same, the skeleton of the story stayed the same, but I had a lot of backstory to create and I had to really kind of flesh out the body of the novel to give people, the readers, that kind of more fulfilling experience, because while the novel worked to answer the kind of critical creative questions I was asking in my thesis, it wasn't complete in and of itself to be a story for people who weren't reading it in the context of an academic paper. And so that was really hard, but it was also so liberating because I got to write whatever I wanted. I just got to just let it go inside the book, and I didn't have to worry about word count, and I didn't have to worry if I'd strayed from my thesis topic. And so it was hard to find that motivation and that energy to revisit that manuscript, but at the same time it was really invigorating, and it was probably the most fun I had with the book over the entire life that I've lived with it, which is a very long time. So yeah, but the word count doubled basically. So in the last year I wrote, I doubled the size of the manuscript in order to get it ready for publication. Okay. Does anybody have any more questions? I've answered all my pre-done ones. Have a sip of tea. Give you another second to think of anything. Oh, Shelley. Was it difficult to cut so many words, and did I feel as I was taking character plot points? It was really hard. And it goes back to that kill your darlings kind of sensation. But at the same time, I had to be so laser focused that it came out much stronger, because I still got the same story out in, it happened in 2 lots. I took from 120 to 90, from 90 to 45. And it's so much better. And in fact, when I went back to flesh it back out again, almost pretty much nothing from the early drafts made it back in, which I think is a really good indication that it was fat that had to go anyway. Where I did feel really disloyal was getting rid of the Beryl perspective and making her speak only through her daughter's viewpoint. I was very, very keen that Beryl had her own voice, because older women in narratives are so often overwritten and spoken for by their daughters. They're kind of usurped by their daughters, and I desperately didn't want to do that. I wanted Beryl to be completely out there on her own. But at the end of the day, it was doubling up. I was doubling up my narrative by having Sarah time traveling, and Beryl. It became too repetitive and too much crossover. And so it was much stronger without it. But I do feel tempted to maybe give Beryl her own little side story somewhere. But yeah, it was hard. It was really hard, but I think it was a very beneficial exercise in clarifying exactly what it is you're trying to say. Okay, is that everybody done, I think? Oh, no, Jess. How have you found the process of marketing your book, especially with the COVID? Yes. So launching a book. So I launched my book on the 15th of March, and basically the entirety of Australia shut down on the 16th of March. And so this thing I had waited for all my life just felt like it had vanished before my eyes. But as is inevitable, and people who are in the writing community will know, Australian authors are just the bomb. They are so good. And by the end of that week, even though my scheduled live, in-person author talks had cancelled because of COVID-19, suddenly all this life sprang up online, and people were producing Facebook pages and promoting and offering to help. And in fact, I even have a list of people to say thank you to. Kristen Krauth started Writers Go Forth launch promote Facebook page, and from there I got connected to Underground Writers, who were so lovely to host me tonight. I did a reading for Read Tasmania, the lockdown reading group, which is such a good idea that people come on and they just read your story and you don't have to be an author. So I highly recommend you check that out. There's lots of good stuff happening there. I've appeared on blog posts. Louise Allen, Jodie Gibson, Narelle Harris, Rosemary Putty from the book podcast made me a beautiful video for promotion. And so while I was pretty despondent to start with, it was absolutely heartening and heartwarming the amount of people who have no connection to me, have no idea who I am. I mean, I'm a debut novelist. Nobody cares about them. it's unbelievable the kind of groundswell of support and kindness that is out there. So in all honesty, I'm probably feeling more optimistic and more connected to people as a result of everybody banding together to be supportive. I think had I just launched with an indie publisher and I'm a unknown author, I think I wouldn't have maybe even had the opportunity to do something as awesome as this. So it's been hard, but it's also made me explore new avenues and made me put myself out there more. And I'm really grateful for all the help that I've had so far. Oh, here we go. In the terms of time travel aspects of the book, did you encounter any issues with the plot holes or problems with making a cohesive narrative? Any advice for authors wanting to write similar stories? So the time travel elements of my story were the most contentious elements of my story. Every single person that read it had a different opinion on what worked, what didn't, and what needed to happen, right up to the day it was published. I wanted very much for my characters to coexist in the same space as the same person. A little bit of a spoiler there. And so plot holes, I don't know. I don't think I had too much problem with plot holes, but I had a lot of problem with point of view, and that became very difficult to write and very confusing, and I had to restructure the book entirely to kind of get it to go through. So my advice would be, if you are doing any time manipulation in a future story, maybe don't pants it like I did. Maybe do a bit of plotting and be very careful of tracking what you said, what's happened. My time travel is very much about looking to who Beryl is. And so there's not a lot of opportunity for the past narrative to kind of interfere with the present day narrative in that sense that you would normally think of in a time travel book. What would I like people to take away from reading my book? Yes. That I would like people to take away that we all have our own version of the truth, and they're all true. What I think is true, what my mum thinks is true, what my daughter thinks is true, it's all true to us. And that multiple truths can coexist in the same moment, and they all feed into who we are. So in my book, Beryl's truth and Sarah's truth are very, very different, but they both feed into who Beryl and Sarah both think they are. And so I think I really would like people to take away this idea that kind of we are living in a very shifting landscape, and that there is no clear line from here to here. Where do you draw your best creativity from? Personal experience observing others, like at the airport. Observing others. And I get a lot of my stories from dreams. I'm a very vivid dreamer, and I will often kind of scroll in the night or wake up in the night, especially for the kind of my more offbeat stories. A lot of my favourite stories that I have written have come to me as a dream, and I wake up in the morning very, very clear of what they are, and I will write them down. So it's a bit of an odd one, but I do like watching people and kind of spying a little bit. Just a bit cheeky, but I think we all do that. So it's a bit of a mixture of both. Will we see these characters again? No. A few people have asked me that, and I think it's very, very unlikely that we will see these characters again. I think they represented a time in my life where I needed them desperately, and I have moved on, and I think they have moved on. And while I love them, and maybe Beryl will get a feature of a short story somewhere just so I can apologise to her, but for cutting her out in the first place. But no, I don't. This isn't a book that lends itself to being a sequel. When it comes to the contentious elements of the book, did you listen to certain readers' opinions more so than others? So this is from Shelley. Yes, I did take opinions from some more than others, and I think that's inevitable. And a couple of times I stood my ground as well, where I just said, no, I disagree, that's staying. I had early advice that the time travel had to go altogether. But for me, it was a pivotal part of the book, and it's the bit that made me the most excited about the book. But yes, I restructured my time travel chapters completely in following the advice of the editor at JTW Publishing for Jen, who just said that what I had done, while it was really interesting, just wasn't clear enough. And so while it kind of broke my heart a little bit, I'm not going to lie, I had my heart set on the way I had written it. But I listened and I changed it, and I can't say I disagree in retrospect, and I think that's often the case. Sometimes you're just too close to your own work and too obsessed with an idea you have fixated on to really see whether it's working or not. So yeah, I'm always open to taking advice from others, especially learned advice. You know, if you've got an editor or, in my case, a supervisor at university who's done this many, many times, and that is their job. It has been my experience that nobody has given me feedback to be malicious. It is always with the intention of making your work stronger, making your work better. And so I haven't always agreed, and I haven't always taken it on board, and there's been some things I've said no to, but largely people are coming from a place of knowledge and from a good-hearted place, and often, more often than not, the result is better. And, you know, there's no harm in trying it. If somebody gives you a piece of advice, you know, take it out, write it, put it back in, and if it doesn't work, you can go back to what you had before. So I think it's always worth experimenting with advice that other people give you. Any plans for a story based in Japan? No. No, I spend too much time in Japan as it is. So for people who don't know, my husband and I and my kids, we spend every summer in Japan snowboarding. It's a horrible life we lead. And I love Japan. It's like a sort of spiritual homeland in its own way. But no, I really feel I want to write about Australia, to be honest. I like Australian stories and Australian voices and Australian experiences. So I don't have a great interest in writing books set other than in Australia, unless they're complete science fiction or fantasy, which may happen one day. I may have a science fiction book brewing in the background. So, yeah. All right. Wow, you guys have been so patient. You've listened to me for a whole hour. I didn't think I would be able to talk for that long. It has been such a delight, and I'd really like to thank Jess from Underground Writers for moderating this and setting this all up and being so kind to me by having me on, and Underground Writers in general for being so generous with their support, helping new authors and emerging authors find a voice in a very difficult world. Oh, thanks, Claire. And thank you, Shelley. Some of your questions were really, really great. I'm not a very good question asker of people. When I go and see other authors, I sort of sit there, and then 3 hours later I come back and think, oh, I should have asked this. So it's really nice when people are able to think on the spot and actually ask something really insightful and helpful. So I really hope you have enjoyed my talk, and I hope it's inspired you to maybe read my book. We're having a bit of glitch file glitch errors with Amazon at the moment. They're sourcing their prices from the US, so it's pricing at $65, but that is in the works to be repaired. And there was a Kindle glitch, or a digital file glitch, which has been fixed. We're just waiting for it to be relaunched on their website. So if you're looking for a digital copy, just hang fire, it is coming. And if you already bought a digital copy, it will be replaced with the unglitchy file shortly. Otherwise, if you're in Australia, you can buy The Place Between direct from JTW Publishing, and thank you. And it was free shipping. Book Depository, I believe, has it correctly priced. And if you're in Perth or the Southwest, you can buy from Planet Books. Both Northbridge and Mount Lawley have it in stock. Diabolic have it in stock. And Text & Co. in Dunsborough have it in stock. Otherwise, your local bookstore, Crow, Rabble, New Edition, should all know about it and be able to order you a copy. And of course, the more people that ask their bookstores to order it in, the more likely their bookstores are to stock it. So you're doing local authors a big favour if you ask your local bookstores to stock their books. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to hang up. It feels a bit weird to sort of just press an end button, but hopefully I will get to talk to you all soon. Thank you.